Good morning and welcome to another exciting discussion, Indian Democracy at Work. Today we have with us Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan, former member of the Indian Administrative Service and National Advisory Council. Dr. JP, as he is popularly known, is General Secretary and founder of Foundation for Democratic Reforms, a think tank based on public policy based out of Hyderabad. Good morning, Dr. JP.
Morning, Keshav.
We are in an exciting phase of electioneering in the United States. I don't know how much of global implications it has, but it has definitely created a lot of hysteria. The elections, although in the most advanced democracy seems to have been completed, there seems to be utter chaos and disarray as far as the results are concerned. Is this democratic? Can these problems be attributed to self-correcting mechanisms in democracy, or is there some fundamental flaw in the American democratic system?
Let me talk about the disarray that you're talking about in the election management. I take a slightly different view. We have a strong election commission in India, independent, respected, with all the senior officials of the All India services playing a critical role in managing elections. And therefore, while the political process is ugly and murky, the election management process is reasonably orderly given our poverty and our lack of technology. But look at the way Americans are managing the polling process as well as the counting process. All the people who are leading the effort are partisans. These are all people locally elected, or the party's representatives in various commissions and committees. And yet there is not one credible complaint in any single one of the 50 states of the United States about any of these elected officials or other partisan workers acting improperly, violating the law, or acting in a partisan manner to affect the outcome of the election. That speaks volumes of the culture of a society, the strength of local governments, the basic commitment to certain values universally accepted, that the rules of the game in elections must be respected, must be valued. That whatever be my political preferences, I will count everybody's vote. Everybody's vote is valued, and that is sacrosanct, and that's how an elected democratic government is established. I think we must admire that. Now, people who are very critical of American election process compared to us, and we ourselves in the last discussion identified some areas where our founding fathers have anticipated some of these problems and created institutional mechanisms. We are proud of them, we are grateful to them. But the deeper issue of culture, practices, and universal acceptance of certain norms in organizing elections, I think it's awesome. The second part of your question, is there something wrong with American system? No, I think it's a bit more complicated. Unquestionably, the broken government that is inevitable in the separation of powers doctrine. You forget the courts anyway have to be a separate organ. Even in India we accept it, world over that is accepted in democratic societies. But if the legislature and executive are separated, if they both compete and fight for influence, it's a good thing because nobody is now concentrating power. That is the basic philosophy of separation of powers. But perhaps one of the underlying factors in the emergence of somebody like Trump, with obviously qualities less than desirable, the conduct which is less than wholesome, that probably became attractive to a large number of people because the government they see is broken at the federal level as opposed to local level. Obama government was paralyzed by a Congress which opposed him for partisan reasons, not because of serious policy differences. Simply they wanted to stymie his government. They wanted to paralyze his government. I think people are vexed with that. People wanted a doer. Whether norms are followed, propriety is followed, whether constitutional spirit is adhered to or not is immaterial. But we want somebody who does things. Doesn't matter how. Perhaps that played a role. And the fact that Donald Trump got so much of support this time, he may be losing the election by a narrow margin in a few states, but he got immense public support. It was not the kind of a dramatic defeat that many people in the world hoped and expected for Trump. It's not true. Trump got actually the highest number of votes in the history of American presidential election. Save the winner today Joe Biden. After him, he still got the highest number of votes. That can't be taken lightly. So what it means is that people are looking for a quote-unquote strong leader, disregarding the constitutional norms, forgetting the origins of American politics, that they created a federal government which is deliberately relatively weak compared to the states and local governments, because they started with the local governments, then states, commonwealths or states, and then federal government, and forgetting that they deliberately created a government based on the doctrine of separation of powers, based on Montesquieu's theory of separation of powers. American people, I think, have forgotten that. They are vexed with a broken government, as they say. They want a government that acts, or at least that appears to act. I think that's an important lesson. I believe separation of powers is a good idea. I believe concentration of powers, either horizontal or vertical, is a bad idea, but it does not mean there must be disharmony in government. We must figure out a way of working together, the way much of Western Europe does, the way Scandinavia does, the way Germany does. It's a unique country, Germany, where the two main contenders for power, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, they actually oftentimes form a coalition together. These are the two competing people for the position of head of government. And yet they happily come together and form a cabinet and work. That's a degree of harmony which is unthinkable in a country like the United States, and perhaps even in India. Maybe we have to learn to discover a way of working with harmony while we air our policy differences and get the mandate of the people. Once you get the mandate of the people, we get a unified approach to govern the country. I think that's a remarkable culture of Western Europe primarily, particularly Scandinavia, etc., and countries like Germany, but not of United States. Maybe you have to learn a lesson from that, because we are following the American model of high degree of polarization in politics. But that apart, I would argue that there are serious social and political or economic issues which are political manifestations. You don't have a social strife which is not manifested in some form other than a democracy. In a dictatorship like China, partly because of the economic success, therefore fulfilling the aspirations of most of the people, that is genuine, authentic success. And we must admire the Chinese government and their leaders for that. Partly because if there is dissent and economic or social strife, Chinese government suppresses it ruthlessly. And people know they have no other recourse. And people are resilient, therefore they accept that too. There is no other recourse. But in a democracy, by definition, you cannot suppress that dissent or anger. A, you have liberty to speak freely, to organize, to protest, and B, you have the vote. Together, they can be a volatile combination if there is tremendous economic flux and a social crisis. In America, there is an economic and social problem. The economic problem is, for the first time in American history, in modern American history, this generation of Americans feel they are going to be worse off than their earlier generation. In India, we cannot even imagine that, because even almost every family, today's generation is better off than their parents. And even in a poor country, we are all reasonably confident that our children probably will be better off than us, because we are a growing economy. In America, for a variety of reasons, a situation has come in which the working class white people, they feel that they and their children will be worse off than their predecessors. That's a tremendous economic issue in an incredibly rich country with a sense of being number one in the world. And the second is demographic issue. The white immigrants from Europe, they built America. They united a continent. They created a miracle in the absence of natural resources relative to, let's say, South America, for instance. And they created a wonder that is America. And for the first time, they feel that they are going to be a minority in the next 20 years or so, in a country they believe their ancestors and they have built. It is their country in their own self-image. And now they are not able to stomach the idea that politically and demographically they could be actually equal to or a minority in their own country. So this social and that economic factor have tremendous political implications in a free society. And what is happening in America today is a reflection of that. It's not merely a question of a Donald Trump or somebody. It is contextual. The kind of leadership that emerges, the kind of direction that they show is contextual. But the underlying factors are much deep-rooted. And in India too, just now I was talking to some young friends. They were trying to help young people to get skills for employment. What I'm hearing is something very disturbing. The government, successive governments have created large programs for training young people for employment, skilling them. But many people participating there, they find it's a very perfunctory program. Of course, in India, governments are notoriously inefficient in translating a good idea into action. But that apart, most of the young people joining the programs are doing it with absolutely no desire or interest in enhancing their skills and enhancing their earning capacity. They are not looking into the future. We also have to understand the underlying factors. The very poor quality of education which only gives certificates with zero life skills. A social culture where parasitism is perfectly all right. A media culture and a film culture where you're not looking at your life seriously, there's no self-reliance. And a political culture where a large number of unemployed youth are used from time to time as cannon fodder for their politics without any purpose. And ultimately, it's leading to a tremendous crisis. And it certainly will have volatility in elections, these young people, and profound political consequences. So there's wise leadership that shows a sensible path forward and utilizes this energy for the right cause, that could be good. If there is a wrong leadership that polarizes people, that fragments society for political power, that plays upon the anger and hatred of these people and channelizes it in terms of caste, region, religion, language in the country, that will be a disaster for the country. There's an important lesson we have to learn. And then the media. Fox TV is perhaps the single biggest cause of social and political strife in America. Making people believe that there's only one word, making untruth the truth, repeating untruths repeatedly, completely fusing opinions and their own version of facts. Facts are sacred, as we say. Opinion is cheap. You can all have your opinions, but facts must be agreed upon. If you don't agree upon facts, there can't be any meaningful discourse. In the absence of meaningful public discourse, a large section completely is wedded to one idea, only one channel of news, one channel of views, one worldview. Another large section, another channel of news and views, and only one worldview, and there is now tribalism. On top of it, in very complex societies like ours, in America it's the white and black or minorities versus the Anglo-Saxons. In India it is caste, region, religion. If these primordial loyalties are allowed to go unchecked for political purposes, and our leaders in India are reckless in using these factors for political gain. Caste, region, religion, all three are used to the hilt in this country. But if you don't put a check on that, you could lead to an extremely dangerous polarization in society. I think there are important lessons we have to learn from the United States.
Also, Dr. JP, before going into the polarization and tribalization of the society, there's one point that I beg to differ with you and disagree, and maybe get your opinion on this. In India, we have observed elections right from Zilla Parishad, state elections, the national elections. Not in one election that we recall, there was pandemonium for transfer of power, just like it's happening in the United States. And we would all have to agree, does US have to learn something from us?
Or is it some great structure we have?
I agree with you. For a country at our level of democratic evolution, political evolution, the constitutional institutions created by our founders with great foresight are remarkable. And by and large, they have worked. A mighty leader like Indira Gandhi, an unchallenged leader for a long time, with a monopoly of power of her party over the union and the states from independence onwards. She could be felt with consummate ease in 1977. It was a remarkable tribute to Indian democracy. That was possible because even in a semi-authoritarian regime, an independent constitutional authority existed and they acted independently. And subsequently, a man like Seshan made it much more vocal and therefore made it known to the people that there are authorities that can act beyond the whims and the fancies of a government of the day. That certainly is a great help to us. But we must recognize, while today, because of Trump's personality, what's happened is a bit of a confusion, largely created by the president of the country itself, the head of the state himself. In a large majority, while there is a tremendous variation in the manner of election, There is confusion because the rules vary from county to county, from state to state. But the manner of conduct of election, the dignity and decorum, the integrity of the process, and the constitutionalism beyond partisanship is remarkable. So I do think that America probably will have to do something about creating a body, if there is bipartisan consensus, which will create at least a common framework across the country about the manner of polling, whether it is mail-in ballots or the dates of polling or what ballot papers will be counted, what will not. The confusion could be avoided. But otherwise, the rest of it is actually a tremendous story of success, something that we should all emulate over a period of time, because American democracy started with the local governments, not with the federal government. Then they created the commonwealths or the provinces. Then came the federal government by a conscious, deliberate act and a lot of compromise between the states in framing the constitution and creating a federal government. The federal government in America was very weak initially. It had only a few common objectives, period. Eventually, because of the Civil War and later the New Deal of Roosevelt, because of the economic and the political compulsions, federal government became stronger. But even today, the strongest government in America is not the federal government. That is the most publicized government. That is the most important government for the rest of the world, because American foreign policy is vital for all of us. But otherwise, for American people, the strongest government is their local government. Next is their state. The federal government is the last one, except in terms of tax rates, etc.
Talking about American politics, I would just like to understand one point. President Trump was leading on the economic issues front and also on securities issues. If you took a common poll, they would say President Trump would be a better candidate. America generally votes on pocketbook. The critics agree, or the journalists agree, or people in large agree that America votes for financial issues and pocketbook issues. On the contrary, in the same election, Joe Biden, Vice President Joe Biden, was leading way too up in the polls. However, all this turned around and it ended up being a very closely contested contest. What would be the main?
I think if Biden is winning, it's only by a whisker. You're absolutely right. I think scholars who understand American society better, who have enormous wealth of knowledge, probably they have to do a lot of research and deliberate. I'm sure Americans will do that, because Americans are good at it. But from a distance, as objective but somewhat uninformed observers, we can glean certain things, we can discern certain things. From a democratic standpoint of view, from constitutionalism standpoint of view, for many of us from a distance, this kind of an election anywhere in the world should have been about right and wrong, about constitutionalism and violating the constitutional spirit. And therefore, it's very clear, black and white. Like Indira Gandhi was defeated by the people of India in 1977. They did not look at the pocketbook or economic policies. They simply looked at authoritarianism. They said it's wrong, and they sent her back, packing her back home. That's what many of us expected across the world. And I think many American media and the middle classes and educated people expected that. But evidently, that did not play as much a role as was expected. The initial polls, it appears, have not really captured that other factors, not the constitutionalism and right and wrong and the personality of a leader, which is very unbecoming in a modern society. That was not the key issue, but the minor policy differences exaggerated. And America is fantastic in exaggerating the minor policy differences. There's a narcissism of small differences. Whether it's about the right to have guns, the Second Amendment, or the woman's right to abortion versus so-called right to life, or about economic policies, an extreme sense of laissez-faire economy where state has almost no role, to at least some measure of role in improving quality of education and health care kind of things. Even those relatively minor differences are exaggerated beyond proportion in that country. So a different kind of tribalization and policy differences elevated to a level of religion is another thing that happened, apart from the obvious social and cultural differences because of black and white, actual racism and so on and so forth. I think if COVID did not happen, no matter how obnoxious Trump's behavior was, It appears now with hindsight that he would have won the election hands down because of the reasons that you mentioned, the pocketbook. Americans feel that economy did reasonably well, not as well as Trump argued, but definitely reasonably well. Unemployment came down, wages were slowly creeping up, and so on and so forth. Notwithstanding Trump's otherwise obnoxious behavior. And I think it's the COVID crisis and the more and more intemperate behavior of the president that led to at least some segment of the population decide that enough is enough, and therefore by a whisker I think he lost. And a consensual leader who would like to unite the country and heal, he is made the leader despite his advanced age.
Thank you, Dr. JP. Most of us are also worried about polarization of many countries. You can see that trend all over, whether it's in Turkey, India, or in the United States, and maybe in some European countries too. Is there some way that this polarization can be minimized, brought the country together to get it on one, to keep the priorities straight? Is there a quality or is there an institution that can address this problem?
There are three short points I can make. The first is, we are actually lucky as a society, despite all our failings and obvious illiteracy and inadequate democratic experience and of course poverty, etc. One advantage that we have is that once we elect a government, Indian people are willing to give the leadership a chance. And because ours is a united government as opposed to separation of powers doctrine, once the head of the government at the state or national level is elected, as long as he or she commands a majority of the house, there is no restraint on making laws. You are not stymied. Actually, it may go to the other extreme, where the head of the government can become authoritarian. But in terms of efficiency of government, the paralysis that you see in the federal government in the United States often is simply not necessary or is not a natural consequence in our system of government. That apart, the people have respect for authority in India. If the leaders are still failing, it's because they are not really utilizing the mandate given by the people. Once they feel a leadership is reasonably credible and they have certain good intentions in translating some ideas into action, people are willing to accept any amount of hardship, even when the policies are either misplaced or hasty. Take, for instance, demonetization. Even if the idea was sound, the way it was implemented was absolutely draconian and ill thought out. But the people of India, they bore that pain with a grin, ungrudgingly. There was no desire to protest. People said, all right, we suffered, but doesn't matter, it's done with good intentions, let's hope it will work. Now, as long as that quality is there, if leaders use it wisely, we don't have a problem, because the political differences or the competition for power is not necessarily paralyzing a government in India. And if leaders pretend that it is paralyzing, they are finding an excuse, an alibi for failure. The people of India actually want their leaders to succeed, irrespective of party, at every level. And this is actually a cautionary tale for our leaders. Don't find excuses. Don't say, I don't have enough majority. Don't say, people are not with me. People are with you if you do the right thing. If you're not doing the right thing, it's your problem. Or if you're not doing the right way, it's your problem, not the people's problem. There's something amazing about Indian people. The second thing is, if you want to avoid paralysis of government, if you want the people to cooperate in the government's endeavors, then the media is important. Unfortunately, our media is increasingly imitating the American media. There are so many wonderful things about American media, but not everything is wonderful. We must have a more consensual approach, a debate and discussion, not to win arguments, but to persuade each other. If I recognize the merit in what you are saying, if you recognize the merit in what I am saying, no matter how many differences we have on issues, there is a middle ground possible. If we shout at each other, if we only want to win an argument and humiliate each other, then there is no middle path possible at all. Ours is the nation that invented middle path. Buddha's whole philosophy was about the middle path. The nation, the culture that gave the Buddha, one of the greatest human beings in the history of mankind, to the world, if that nation forgets the middle path, the ability to reconcile differences harmoniously, the ability to accept the other person's adversary's point of view when it is right, that is the Gandhian path. Gandhiji's enduring success in fighting the British or uniting the people in India is this. He recognized the adversary's point of view, put forth his point of view, and therefore a middle path was possible. If we ignore that, then you cannot have harmony. The governments cannot perform. And the third thing is, for the people to come in support of the government or in support of policies, sometimes which are painful, because there's always a clash between the long-term public good and the short-term pain that the people have to endure. Whether a child who has to study today, instead of gallivanting and having fun, an athlete who has to, practice very hard with enormous pain instead of having fun because he wants to excel. In any sector, delayed gratification is critical. In democratic politics, it's a very hard one, because if you tell people you bear the pain today but tomorrow will be a good day, it's very hard to convince people. Therefore, there's always a temptation to yield to the short term. Now, how can you think of the long term? Be willing to pay a price in the short term. One is the extraordinary qualities of leadership and credibility. Time and again, great leaders made people sacrifice in the short term for a great cause, but that's not easy. That happens in moments of tremendous emotional and moral upsurge. But most governance is bread and butter. It can't be a great, grand moral endeavor on a day-to-day basis. Therefore, you have to create local governing authorities. The locus of power must be so local that I actually see the benefit that will accrue to me if I pay a price today. It's like a family. What happens in a family? Everybody in a family is willing to sacrifice. Why? Because they see the collective good of the family. If I give up some small things today, maybe I can have a better home, better education, better business, better future. You can see that, you can feel that, and it is yours. It is not theoretical. It is not somebody's distant dream. It is yours. And you are in charge. That's the most important thing. You are in charge. Now, in government, when do you feel you are in charge? Never, unless the government is very local. Unless it takes care of your local road, your local school, local hospital, local traffic, local park, and so on, because that is real. Every day you use it. If you give a grand national theme in a moment of nationalist surge or populism, you may get excited, but ultimately it has no value for you because it's not deliverable. And you don't see the link between what they do and what happens to your life. So localization of power with responsibility. The United States is remarkable in that. It has the most localized governments. In fact, if you have sovereignty in the US, it's probably more at the local level than at the state and federal level. And therefore, people in a large measure see what is there in it for them. And therefore, they're able to transcend the ideological and other differences. And that's why at the local level, the Democratic and Republican Party people, they don't fight the way they fight at the federal level. They don't paralyze each other because people will simply stand up against them. And because of your ideological fights, if you don't give the people the road, the water supply, the municipal services, the law and order, and the rule of law, people will rebel immediately because it's affecting them immediately. So local government is one good way of harmonizing the differences. The more centralized the government is, the fight for power becomes extreme and life and death struggle. It will be very difficult to actually deliver on the promises made, and it will be very difficult to build harmony among political parties or to build bridges with the people.
Dr. JP, just to add to this, what is the importance of leadership in this case? Is there any value to leadership or?
Absolutely. That's why is much of the world and much of America deeply dissatisfied with Trump? Irrespective of policies and actions, the style of leadership is very polarizing, very abusive, very crude, semi-authoritarian, without respect for larger constitutional principles, and there is no empathy at all. But once you have those qualities, empathy, look at Churchill in wartime. Now, Indians dislike Churchill for good reason because he was an imperialist. But forget that. See the kind of leadership he provided to the British people during war. He did not give an authoritarian leadership because war gives obviously the leaders extraordinary power. No. He discussed, he conveyed, he talked to them as equals. He understood their pain. understood their suffering. He gave a voice to that, and he gave a reason why that pain and that suffering that must be endured for a larger cause. Versus an authoritarian leadership where, no, if you don't agree with me, I give you the choicest words, and it's my personal ego rather than the public good, and I'm authoritarian. The first sign of any dissent, even in inner circles while framing policy or debating issues, then you're out. This is absolutely uncivilized, very uncharacteristic of a modern democracy. That's the reason why, while Trump may have been seen as an effective executive on occasion, cut and dried and all, done kind of a thing, maybe some of it is appealing to some people, to a vast majority of people in the world, and the world matters, at least America matters for the world, therefore our opinion has value, at least in our view. Though for Americans it's inconsequential, their votes matter. But ultimately a majority of Americans still rejected, not so much because of economic policies or anything, because of the style of leadership. Whereas a consensual leadership, a far-sighted leadership, preparing people for the struggle ahead, a truthful leadership, treating people as equals, allowing dissent, differences not becoming disagreeable, that is a vital requirement in a democracy. There's no question about it. And some people are even greater. They have the far-sightedness to make people see beyond the immediate, look for the next generation. That is how a great man like Abraham Lincoln, he could make people sacrifice 10% of all the able-bodied males in the American North and even the South. They died in that Civil War. And imagine the American North losing so many people for a cause of liberation of the slaves. Of course, there are the economic factors behind it, but that alone cannot explain why people are willing to die. Unless there is an idealism inspired by a great leader and an ambience, it's not possible to be willing to die. That's the ultimate cause, or to sacrifice your own children. Or take Franklin D. Roosevelt, the New Deal, or the Great Society, the Civil Rights Movement, the Democratic Party committed suicide. American South was entirely Democratic Party's playfield. Republicans had no space there. Today, Republicans, they dominate the South. When one or two states now, Georgia and Arizona, now there is some change beginning to happen. But otherwise, American South is the Republican Adda, as we call it today. It was the Democrats' playfield earlier. And Lyndon Johnson, he was not a moral giant maybe, but when he signed that Civil Rights Act, he knew he was giving up the South. That required far-sighted leadership, a willingness to sacrifice personally and politically, and willingness to make people look at things a little differently, and therefore be willing to pay the price necessary for constitutional values. So leadership has a tremendous role, there's no question about it. But leadership cannot be guaranteed. It may emerge sometimes if we are lucky. Leadership is the most precious commodity. Independent of leadership, if institutional mechanisms are not there to allow us to work in harmony and to make us realize our own long-term self-interest, if you only depend on leadership, then there is a potential danger. If you are lucky as a country or a society, you may have great leadership. If you are unlucky, then you don't have that. And that means you are allowing your future to be dictated by a lottery. That is not wisdom. That's why Ambedkar always argued for institutions. Mahatma Gandhi argued for moral leadership. Absolutely moral leaders are required. But if your future depends entirely on the morality of leaders alone, then your future is very dangerous and uncertain. Therefore, Ambedkar argued you must build institutional mechanisms. American Constitution itself is about institutions, not about one grand leader. Even their founding leader, though he had immense stature, the man who won their War of Independence, even George Washington never behaved like a monarch, never behaved like a great leader. He behaved like an ordinary human being. And he voluntarily, there was no constitutional embargo at the time, he voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms. In fact, there were many people in America, because they were experienced with monarchy, they asked him to become a monarch. He rejected that notion. Imagine an Indian politician at the local level or at the state or national level, if the people say, please become a monarch, you think our leaders will wait for 1 second? So, institutions are vital. It is not to de-emphasize leadership. It's not to denounce leadership or debunk leadership. But leadership is often an accident. Institution is a choice. It's better to depend on choice. If accidents happen, happy accidents happen, we are lucky. But even in the absence of happy accidents, society must thrive.
Finally, Dr. JP, what was bothering most of younger people here was that the last few days, American elections were going on and the results were being counted. There was hysteria in the media, and there was people were glued more to the TVs. And we haven't seen that in our local elections, where the issues were my electricity, my water, my basic facilities that my civic government has to provide. The debates were not as intense as they were relating to consequences in America.
It's a great question.
Why is it that way?
I think we all want drama. Like a powerful film, well produced, well directed. We all know it's all fiction. Sometimes we know even the end of the story. But despite that, it's gripping. So it's a gripping story because there is a suspense. In this case, we don't know the end of the story. Until it happened, we don't know the end of the story. It's gripping. And with a personality like Trump, whatever you say about him, he's a very engaging, entertaining personality. So it's exciting, whether you support him or oppose him. Therefore, America and the whole world are gripped. And second, you like it or not, America is still the most profound influence in the world today. Politically, culturally, economically, and democratically. There's no question about it. And third, maybe it's a good civic education for all of us. Maybe instead of giving them a lot of civics lessons in classes which are boring and totally unrelated to life and life's experiences, maybe these kinds of things will teach a lot more people and make them think a lot more about some issues and the nature of politics and institutions. So it's not a bad thing. I don't mind it. In fact, I must candidly confess that my own indoctrination into civic life and understanding constitutionalism and democracy and how democracy should work and accountability, etc., it was shaped by two parallel events. In India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi imposing emergency when there was a challenge to her authority from the students and many other elements. Instead of dealing with that in a creative and constructive way, she found an authoritarian solution because she had enough power, she had numbers with her in the parliament. And subsequently, even her government was thrown out by the people in a remarkable outcome. In fact, probably in the history of democratic world, it was one of the most remarkable episodes that a desperately poor and country with very little experience in organizing democracy, with feudal notions of power, could do it with such gusto is actually a miracle when we look back. Now, the more I see the world and in India, the more I realize how 1977 was a highly improbable miracle. But despite that, nothing much changed. Once Janata came to power, well, the constitutionalism was restored, liberty was restored, governance did not improve, and life was pretty much back to usual. In America at the same time, a mighty president, Nixon, and a very successful president minus the terrible episode that felled him finally, both in foreign policy and domestic policy. A mighty president was felled because of relatively minor infractions. He did not commit grave crimes when you look back actually. They were relatively minor infractions. But the way the society came together and the parties buried their partisan differences, the majority Republican Senate and Congress actually went and told the president, you must go, and the president was forced to quit finally. It was awesome. That contrast was actually the defining feature of my own evolution as a person. If I did not follow American elections and American political process and the Watergate scandal and the impeachment proceedings in 1972, 73 and 74 with such intensity at a young age, and did not follow the Indian events simultaneously, the movements against corruption and misgovernance, and the emergency and the post-emergency situation in India, I probably would have been hopefully a successful or maybe not so successful doctor or a public health exponent in the country or elsewhere, and would have had my own life. So I think this kind of education, if you not merely as a drama, but actually get a little deeper into it, what happened, what are the circumstances, what are the political and economic forces and social forces that shape events, and what are the lessons we can learn, and where we are actually strong, where we are weak, I think it's a very good civics lesson. So if indeed many people are paying attention, if it's not merely who wins and who loses, that's secondary really. But what's happening, the process behind it, and the consequences, I think it's an extremely positive thing for developing our civic leadership.
But this also comes at the cost of not paying attention to our local needs. And that is where the problem is.
My hope is if we go beyond the drama, if we understand what happens in America or Britain or Germany or Japan, how some of the wealthiest countries are bothered about rule of law, what's actually happening to the citizen and interface with the police or with the courts, how your healthcare is all important, how the quality of education and skills and therefore jobs, what determine the electoral outcomes and your voting preferences. Ultimately, it's about you and your life. It's not about a grand theme. It's not about Hindutva. It's not about secularism. It's not about some grand notion which I don't understand as a citizen most of the time. It's not about Bharat Mata. It's about my life, my family's life, my environment, my school, my healthcare center, my road, my traffic there, the local sense of security I have on the roads or my daughter has on the roads, and my park. I think if we recognize that that is ultimately the centrality of American politics beyond all the verbiage, maybe we will recognize the importance of redefining politics and relocating power, not in Delhi or in Hyderabad or Bengaluru, but in our village, in our town, in our city, in our ward, in our community. So it could be an important lesson.
Thank you so much, Dr. JP.